This is video 3 for week 4 on economics and social inequality. This is kind of the first in a series of lectures on this topic. So let's begin by talking about the difference between sociology and anthropology, because that's finally germane to the discussion of social theory that we're about to have. And a lot of people ask this question of me, as an advisor. Should I take anthropology or sociology? What's the difference? And sometimes we say, well, we know it when we see it, which is not very satisfying. Sometimes we say that sociologists study society and social structure, and anthropologists study culture, and I think that might make more sense after this video lecture. There are two big differences in between the two fields, among others, and they're basically scale and methodology, or at least traditionally this was the case. Today, there's more overlap between the two of them, and this isn't necessarily as true as it was before. But think about scale. So as you're starting to learn about cultural anthropology, anthropologists tend to study very small-scale societies, foragers, small-scale agriculturalists. We tend to study a village that might just have a few hundred people in it. So, for example, now studying the Gabusi, they number only in the hundreds. And when you think about it, that scale requires a certain kind of methodology. So if you're going to study a group of people that only has 200 people in it, then you want to really get to know those 200 people well. So you'll spend a lot of time with them, a lot of interview time. And again, in anthropology, we mostly use participant observation. So you're going to live like they do, try to do what they do, try to understand life on their own terms. So you need a lot of time, and you need to work really closely and intimately with the people in your study. Sociologists have traditionally studied large-scale industrial societies: Great Britain, the United States, China. So, as you can imagine, that scale requires a very different kind of methodology. You can't study 40 Americans in really close, intimate terms and then say that you know something about America. To study America, you need to have a representative sample of probably thousands of Americans. So you might use census data or other kinds of statistical data instead of using ethnography and participant observation. So the methods of sociologists tend to be more quantitative, looking more at statistics, census records, kind of large data sets, so that they can say something more broadly about the social structure of this large-scale industrial society. Now again, they're coming together a little bit more in a lot of ways today. So now there are a lot of anthropologists who do try to study America or China, but they might do it by positioning themselves within a particular small group or setting where groups of people come together. And sociologists are more and more using ethnography and participant observation as one of their methods. But sociology and anthropology, and also political science and economics and religious studies, all began as the same field, and all had a shared set of social theory that informed them in the 19th century and into the 20th century as they started to divide into specializations. And I want to talk about social theory as it affects the topic of social inequality. So Karl Marx was one of the first big social theorists that got sociologists, anthropologists, and others talking about social inequality. So as you may know, Marx was a German, or when he was born it was called Prussian philosopher who lived much over the course of the 19th century and is probably best known for his work with Friedrich Engels entitled The Communist Manifesto. Now, Karl Marx was a social evolutionist. He was very much caught up in this idea that human society is evolving from a beginning to an end. But his steps in social evolution were very different from those of Lewis Henry Morgan and E.B. Tylor and some of the anthropologists we've studied. His version of social evolution has come to be called historical materialism. That wasn't his term for it. It was a term applied later. And notice the word materialism. Marx was not only a social evolutionist, he was also a materialist. So he didn't care about structures in the brain and binary oppositions. He cared about real economic facts on the ground. So here's his version of social evolution. Humanity began in primitive communism, which he called a tribal society. Now, stop here for a second. Marx did not have a very sophisticated understanding of bands and tribes and chiefdoms and foragers and small-scale horticulturalists and pastoralists. He was really focused on European industrial society. So he lumped all those people, all those kind of primitive people, into this category called tribal. And you know enough now to know that there's a lot of complexity there. You can't say the Junhuanzi and the Nuer are the same kind of people. They have different economic lives. So that was a real mistake he made. But he said humanity began basically as foragers, tribal people, that kind of stuff. And they shared everything. They were living in a state of primitive communism. But then, in Europe, feudalism came along. And feudalism was basically one guy getting the idea that he could own all the land and he could put a bunch of peasants to work for him. And then he wouldn't have to work and they could just work really hard and give him, part of what they produced. So this was the first kind of step in the ownership of the means of production. The landowner owned and the peasants worked, and the peasants got to keep some of the products of their work, and then they gave some of those products away to the landowner. Eventually, this system ceded to capitalism, where instead of landowners and peasants, you had factory owners and workers. You had the bourgeoisie, the owning class, and the proletariat, the working class. And now, instead of the peasants getting part of their food and keeping it for themselves, now the production was in the form of wage earning. So you had workers who earned a wage, which they could then convert into food. And there was one step removed between them and kind of the means of production. So you had this kind of further enslavement of one group of people by the other. And so for him, capitalism would kind of reach its logical end through radical socialism or proletarian revolution, when the working class kind of overthrew the bourgeoisie and took back ownership of the means of production through communism. And communism would be back to, as in primitive communism, a truly classless society. So we call today, like the Soviet Union and China and Cuba, communist societies, but really the process only made it to radical socialism. There was never a truly classless society such as Marx envisioned. Now, this process of historical materialism has largely been kind of critiqued and dismissed by social theorists today in terms of its political aspects. But in terms of what it describes economically, it's still very much in favor and very much applied by a lot of people trying to understand social inequality. But it's very limited. So Marx's explanation was limited to class, and he kind of lumped people into these classes. There was the working class and the owning class, and then kind of a class of people, the lumpen proletariat, who were so sort of far down the class spectrum that they weren't even in the working class. And that was it. Everything came down to him, for him to, are you an owner or are you a worker? And so social theorists needed something a little bit more sophisticated than that. So along came Max Weber, who overlapped with Marx in his lifetime and in his intellectual conversation. He was informed by Marx, but critical of him. He worked in the area of the sociology of religion primarily, and you may know his most famous work, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And he came up with this theory of stratification that's based on three related dimensions: wealth, which is economic status, all your material assets, income, land, property, the things that you own; power, or your political status, which he defined as the ability to exercise your will over others; So that can be officially in the realm of politics or more unofficially in the realm of everyday life. And then prestige or social status, which he defined as esteem, respect, approval for your acts, deeds, qualities considered exemplary, aspects of your social persona that caused other people to look upon you favorably. So he said it's not really just about class. It's about a particular combination of wealth, power, and prestige. So he said, you can imagine there are a lot of people in the world who aren't that wealthy, but they're powerful. And there are certainly people who aren't wealthy, but they have a lot of prestige. And there are people who have a lot of prestige, but they never use that to attain wealth and power. So he said you can't just say it's the owners and the workers. You have to look at how people are stratified, groups and individuals, according to their access to wealth, power, and prestige, and the way they combine them. So, again, a little bit more sophisticated. And then the third person I want to talk to you about is Pierre Bourdieu, who was a sociologist and an anthropologist who came along a little bit later. He's one of my favorite anthropologists and social theorists. And he wrote a famous work called Distinction, a social critique of the judgment of taste, in which he argued that we can really look at the way people live class cultures. So they live a different kind of culture depending on their wealth, power, and prestige. So, for example, he argued someone who's working class may win the lottery and have a whole lot of money all of a sudden, or may work his way up in a factory and become a manager and then an owner and may be fabulously wealthy. But he'll still pretty much live, eat, act, and dress like a working class person. He won't change his culture just because suddenly he has a lot more money. And same thing in France, he talked about the aristocratic class who lost all of their wealth and power after the French Revolution, but have hung on to their prestige. So now you have these people with certain last names who don't have any money or power anymore, but they're considered the top of society because they have a prestigious last name that dates back to the French aristocracy. And so they eat beautiful food, they wear beautiful clothes, they're thin, they're elegant, they have very nice social manners. It doesn't matter how much money they have. They live according to the class of the wealthy, prestigious class. So what he was trying to say here was we even have to move beyond looking at stratification to looking at cultural capital, the prestige aspect of Weber's theory. And he argued that prestige provides people with a sense of worth and respect within their class cultures, which they may often convert into economic and political advantage. So he really drew the attention back to culture. So, anthropologists, thank you Marx, thank you Weber, Pierre Bourdieu, you're getting a little bit closer. Really, what we want to look at, unlike the sociologists, we don't want to try to figure out social structure in terms of how class operates and categorizes people. We want to look at how culture works to maintain or level inequalities. So, of interest to anthropologists are how social inequalities are maintained and leveled through cultural practices involving different modes of exchange. Reciprocity and retribution, which we're going to talk about next, and even market exchange, buying and selling.